Hello, I'm Kathleen Olive, and I hope that you enjoy this presentation, which was prepared for Limelight Arts travellers with an interest in Japan. Today, what I would like to do is talk to you about the Ainu people, who are now legally recognised as one of the indigenous people of Japan. Talk about their history, particularly on the island of Hokkaido, and show you some of the cultural manifestations of Ainu way of life that you're likely to encounter when you travel, particularly to Hokkaido. I think the first thing to say is that the word Ainu is a reference by those people to themselves, and it simply means humans or people in the language of the Ainu. The Ainu, we associate them with the island of Hokkaido in the north of Japan, and I'll show you some maps that give our best understanding of how it was that people arrived on the island of Hokkaido in particular. And so if Ainu was the name that these people gave to themselves, the name that they gave to the island where they lived was not Hokkaido, but was actually Mosia, or our homeland, our land. Interest in the Ainu as one of the indigenous peoples of Japan, and in fact, a very specific interest in them as a possible way of understanding the emergence of the human race, or more specifically, of the Caucasian manifestation of humans. This interest really grew in the 19th century, so the time that this image is dated from, for example. And I think something that's very important for us to keep in mind in the way we think about and talk about the Ainu is that the earliest interests that we have in the West, in particular, in understanding the Ainu is one tied to an emerging discipline, and an emerging 19th century discipline of anthropology, but a discipline that at that point was particularly interested in tracing the origins of Westerners, so trying to look for the origins of what we might call Caucasian people. And so if the Ainu are being investigated in the West for that reason, and in Japan for equally political reasons that we'll look at as well, I think we'd acknowledge that we have to be really careful in interpreting and understanding the information that we have, particularly the earliest information that we have, even things like the photographic record of the Ainu people, some really wonderful photographs such as this one, which were taken in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's really important for us to keep in mind the circumstances under which those images were taken, and also the use to which they were going to be put. Similarly, another consideration I think that we need to keep in mind when thinking about the Ainu is that usually when we're looking at the historical origins of a people, we're looking at all cultural manifestations in order to understand that group. So we'll look at their linguistic history, we'll look at their anthropological or cultural histories, we'll also look at archaeological record, and wherever possible, we're going to look for script-based records as well. And so when we are looking at a people or a culture before the written record, we call that prehistory or prehistorical study. And in the West with prehistorical study, we're looking in Europe, for example, at particular timeframes of thousands of years ago. When it comes to Japan, when we talk about prehistory, we're looking at a historical record that dates from before the 6th century AD or the 6th century of the Common Era. So we don't have any written records for the Japanese, written by the Japanese before about the 6th century. And then after that time, if we were to look, for example, at the Ainu, we would not be seeing the Ainu writing about themselves, their own history and their own culture for more than 1,000 more years. So these are really important cultural and political considerations, I think, to take into account, and that is that the Ainu have only very recently been able to tell their own story under their own terms, rather than being considered either as an other with a capital O, or would probably be a better way of phrasing that, as a kind of an anthropological construct, an objective scholarly interest or study for very particular reasons. So in that sense, as you can hear, you know, I'm an Australian, I'm speaking from an Australian context. In that case, in that kind of scenario, we could really understand the ways that the Ainu have been studied and considered as comparable to the ways that the Aboriginal people of Australia or Indigenous Australians have been studied and written about until recent times as well. So it's just important, I think, to keep those considerations in mind. We'll come back to this, but the other thing to keep in mind is that the Ainu are now a legally enshrined Indigenous people of Japan. That's something that happened in the last decades, that they were recognised as an Indigenous group. But what is also acknowledged in census data is that the number of Ainu, so people in Hokkaido, but also throughout the rest of the islands of Japan who identify as Ainu, is quite a low number. So about 25,000 people in the last census in Japan identified as Ainu. It's a much lower number than what is likely to be the real number of people who are culturally Ainu in Japan. And the main reason for that is that, tied up with kind of 19th century colonization, 19th century anthropological and political discussions of the emergence of the human race, tied up with all of those things that I've just mentioned, was also a policy, a national policy in Japan that was implemented from the Meiji period in the 19th century until really the 1990s. There was a policy of assimilation that was taken towards the Ainu. So people might self-identify now as Ainu and understand themselves to be culturally Ainu, but there's a much broader group of people who have that origin, who share that history and that culture, but don't actually know that they do because the policy of assimilation was in place for so long. So it's estimated that actually probably somewhere closer to 200,000 people in Japan are culturally Ainu, but are not aware of that heritage. So 25,000 who identify as Ainu, as opposed to maybe 200,000 of people who are Ainu in origin. This is also reflected in debates about the language. UNESCO does recognise the Ainu language as an endangered language. I'm not going to go so much into discussion of the Ainu language, but it's actually a very interesting area of investigation. It's part of that puzzle of working out who these people are and where they came from, is to look at other languages that Ainu might be tied to. It's a very unresolved question, as much is when it comes to looking at the origin of the Ainu people. For a long time, it was hypothesized that Ainu language was perhaps more closely related to mainland Chinese and even Siberian languages, with some words even having echoes in languages of people such as Eskimo people. But now what's been found is that linguistically, in fact, the Ainu language as it's spoken today, its strongest echoes do actually tie it to the Japanese language. So very, very vexed question, the source of the Ainu language and what other languages it's most closely related to. But what's not in debate is the fact that it's an endangered language. So in 2006, of people who identified as Ainu, just about 25,000, as I said, 304 of those self-identified Ainu people knew the language. Of those 304 people, only 4.6% of them felt confident enough to teach it to someone else. So sadly, and again, as someone speaking from an Australian context, this is a similar kind of picture for Indigenous languages in Australia. There is much work to be done in terms of sponsoring the Ainu language, teaching the Ainu language, and making sure that Ainu culture involves speaking the language as a vibrant part of being Ainu. UNESCO has said, and there's swings and roundabouts, positives and negatives to this perhaps, but UNESCO has suggested that the real number of people who speak Ainu might be higher than that, but they might be hiding their capacities of language because of that long culture of assimilation and prejudice and discrimination that accompanied that. So able to speak Ainu, but perhaps not yet quite comfortable with putting their hand up in a national census to say that. So another important consideration. So I've said to you that the Ainu people are, in the Japanese context, associated with the island of Hokkaido, which you can see marked on this map. But it's equally true that the Ainu can be associated with the island of Sakhalin, today contested between the Russian Federation and Japan, and the Kuril Islands, another contested island group. These two island groups north of Hokkaido have been contested for about 100 years, but they've been particularly contested since 1945. Much of the debate that has swirled around the Ainu people, and which is really a topic of still of great interest, is who they are. So where do the Ainu come from? The dominant narrative in Japan is still to understand them as a kind of a remnant people. So an era and a culture that you often see references to in Japan is the Jomon period. In fact, one of the most popular exhibitions ever to be shown in Japan, with the highest visitor numbers ever experienced, and Japanese exhibitions get the highest visitor numbers in the world anyway, was an exhibition at the National Museum in Tokyo on the Jomon period. Now, it's a huge period. Again, when we're talking about prehistorical periods, when we're looking for variants in historical epochs and cultures, we look at the manifestations that can be uncovered, particularly by archaeology, and pottery is something that is often looked at. The Jomon period in Japan spans from about 14,000 BCE to about 300 BCE. It's a huge span of time, with about 6 different sub-periods within it, mostly identified according to the different types of pottery being made in those periods. And the Jomon people, from an archaeological viewpoint and from an historical viewpoint, but really from the view of a kind of a national identity, the Jomon are understood to be the kind of proto-Japanese. So these are the people living as hunter-gatherers through the main islands of the archipelago, so particularly concentrated on the island of Honshu, who are thought to have come across from the mainland of China thanks to a land bridge in the south of the present archipelago, where you see South Korea on the map. And the Jomon people in this historical narrative are understood circa 300 BCE to have been almost superseded and therefore subsumed into a different cultural group known as the Yayoi culture, or the Yayoi period, named for a really important archaeological site where artifacts from this identifiably different historical epoch were unearthed in a suburb of Tokyo in the 20th century. So that Yayoi is just the name of the suburb where these initial finds were made. And the Yayoi people are fascinating to the Japanese national identity because this is seen as the moment when something that is identifiably modern and Japanese in nature emerges. So it's with the Yayoi people that we start to see kind of urban arrangements, permanent settlements, rather than urban perhaps, are being formed. We see a ruling class emerge out of that. We see one clan become dominant with a group of kind of bureaucrats and courtiers gathering around it. So the kind of emergence somehow of what will become identifiably Japanese in the modern era. Another way of referring to that group of people associated with the Yayoi period is a term that you'll see in some books, which is Wajin. So we might describe the Wajin as being somehow the ethnically Japanese. So under this telling of the story, the Ainu are a kind of remnant people pushed progressively north by the new identifiably Japanese or Wajin group of people until they are eventually forced to cross over the Suguru Strait between Aomori and Hokkaido and make a new homeland for themselves on the island of Hokkaido. And this story is still very dominant, even though archaeological, linguistic, anthropological, and increasingly historical data doesn't really support this telling of the story. But this is the one that you will hear increasingly, that you will read and see, particularly when traveling in Japan. So that part is contested, and in a moment I'll share with you some of the more recent theories about where the Ainu came from and who they are in a sense as an ethnic group. But the second part of the story, the kind of modern story of the Ainu, is less contested, and that's one that is documented then by official Japanese court records and histories in particular. And that is that from the 15th century of our era, of the Common Era, what does happen is that the people living in the north of Japan and on the island of Hokkaido in particular have increasing contact with the people who have their court focused around the city of Kyoto, and then also ruling from the new capital of Edo or Tokyo, that there's increasing contact between those groups of people, principally for the reasons of trade, that by the 16th century, one particular clan associated with the ruling class of Japan, or the shogunate as it's called, is given a kind of concession to hold the island of Hokkaido as somewhat of a personal fief for their clan, that's the Matsumai clan, and that as a result of that, the people living on Hokkaido before that arrival of the Japanese clan of the Matsumai, they are increasingly colonized until in the 19th century, they're very openly colonized by the government in Edo, Tokyo, particularly in response to a growing regional interest in Hokkaido. So there's particular interest in the 19th century from Russia in the island of Hokkaido, and partly as a response to that, partly as a response to kind of internal political reorganizations that see Japan open its borders after hundreds of years of splendid isolation. Japan, the government of Japan, takes a more active interest in colonizing the island of Hokkaido. Until that point, Hokkaido had been known as Ezo, really a reference to how far-flung and remote the island was. It's kind of seen as the ends of the civilized country of Japan. After the kind of open 19th century policy of colonization, we see policies enacted that have a particular influence on the Ainu. So in 1868, Hokkaido's controlled access under the rule of the Matsumai clan is opened up. More foreign experts are brought in to help colonize the island and develop it for a kind of a centralized national priority of agriculture and industry. In 1899, a protection act is instigated that actually leads to the suppression of Ainu culture, the reservation of Ainu people in controlled population groups, and a policy of assimilation is introduced. At the same time, some lands that had traditionally been associated with the Ainu, and here I'm referring particularly to Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, which you see on the map here, those begin to be contested together with Russia, and the Ainu living in those islands are progressively moved off and concentrated onto Hokkaido, so that Hokkaido becomes a place for a kind of centralization of Ainu people who've actually been living differently and speaking different types, different variations of a language, different dialects, we might say, for a very long time. This is exactly the moment at the end of the 19th century when anthropology is growing as a discipline, and there's an interest, a kind of a scholarly interest from the West in Hokkaido, not just from the point of view of exploiting its natural resources, but also from the point of view of understanding its native peoples in order to understand the origins of the human race overall. And it's not until 1997, so 100 years later, that a new policy is introduced by the government in Tokyo. That's the so-called Ainu Shinpo, which actually seeks to restore Ainu language and culture and to make a place for those after 100 years, essentially, of an assimilation policy. It's not until 2019 that the Ainu will be legally recognized as one of the indigenous people of Japan. In terms of the story of where the Ainu really, in inverted commas, came from. So there's this narrative about them being a kind of survival strand of the early primitive Jomon culture, which was replaced then by the Yayoi and then Yamato cultures, which would become emblematic of everything that was recognizably Japanese, and therefore, for a modern Japanese mindset, a civilized culture as well. There's that story which has tended to be quite dominant in terms of the telling of the people of the Ainu and where they came from. In practical terms, the Ainu seem to arrive, particularly on the island of Hokkaido, thanks to ice bridges or land bridges covered in ice that connected really Siberia to what is present-day Hokkaido. And this probably happened about 20,000 years ago. So just as we know that people came onto what is now the Japanese archipelago via a long disappeared land bridge from South Korea to the southern islands of the Japanese archipelago, it's now equally theorized that people arrive in the northern islands of the archipelago thanks to land bridges through, for example, the Kamchatka Peninsula, through what are now the Kuril Islands, but also equally through Sakhalin. Life in the north of Japan developed in a very different way to life in the south of Japan. The climates are very different. The crops were different. Rice, for the longest part of Hokkaido's history, rice had to be imported from Japan. It wasn't grown in Hokkaido. The conditions weren't right for growing rice, and so it had to be imported. It is a part of Ainu culture. Sake is a part of Ainu culture, but always as a kind of a luxury imported commodity. So life was different in the north of the islands as opposed to the south of the islands. And this can be tracked as well through archaeological artifacts. So pottery is different in the north to pottery from the same period in the south. So it really does seem that that story of the Ainu as a kind of remnant proto-Japanese people progressively pushed north and until they're essentially reserved onto the island of Hokkaido. There are elements of that story that are no longer borne out by particularly scientific investigations. So, for example, ice sheets mean that in the late glacial age, Hokkaido was more easily connected to mainland Asia. It was essentially a peninsula of the of what is now mainland Asia because of the climatic conditions that led to the development of these ice sheets. So you can see on the map on your screen that between the present-day island of Hokkaido and the present-day island of Honshu, so below the reindeer in the north and above the moose in the middle right of the map that you have on the screen, we have something called the Tsugaru Strait, and the Tsugaru Strait separates the island of Hokkaido from the island of Honshu, more or less equivalent to the location of present-day Aomori on the island of Honshu. And this strait is very deep, and so even in the late glacial age, it wasn't covered by an ice sheet. So navigating between those two islands of Honshu and Hokkaido required more effort, whereas traveling overland from present-day mainland Asia, present-day Siberia, was actually much easier thanks to these ice sheets. So people, according to this theory, but also animals, migrated in different ways. So, for example, archaeological excavations have uncovered the remains of mammoths on the island of Hokkaido, but not on the island of Honshu, large early elephants, but not mammoths. So even the fauna, the flora, as we've just said in terms of agriculture, but even the fauna of those two groups of islands is different. So in the north where Hokkaido is, we see one type of prehistoric flora and fauna. In the south, we see another for kind of geological and climatic reasons. So people arrive differently and they're also going to live differently. The territory of the Ainu people is extraordinarily broad. So it does seem clear that there were Ainu settlements on the island of Honshu as well as the island of Hokkaido. So that's on the island of Honshu, you see that shaded in pink on the map that you're looking at. There were concentrations of Ainu people there. But the main concentration of the Ainu was always in the islands north of the Tsugaru Strait. So on the island of Hokkaido, on the island of Sakhalin, but mostly concentrated in the south of that island, and also in the Kurile or Kuril Islands. This is a very broad territory. I mean, it looks nice and compact on this map, but if you consider the relative size of Japan as a modern nation to the area covered in red, saturated in red on your map, you'll see that the Ainu were living across three main groups that were very varied and widespread. So the island of Sakhalin, the island of Hokkaido, and the Kurile Islands. Those groups of Ainu are actually referred to differently. So they are called the Hokkaido Ainu, the Kurile Ainu, and the Sakhalin Ainu. They were living differently. They were trading differently. The Kurile Islanders, for example, specialized in capturing and exporting sea otters. They had variant languages, so what we might call different dialects of the same language, and they had different cultural practices as well. But from 1945, a lot of those people living in the south of the island of Sakhalin and living across the Kurile Islands are resettled, in many cases forcibly resettled, onto the island of Hokkaido. This is as a result of expansion by the Russian state. So that you see a concentration in Hokkaido of different groups of Ainu who have different languages one from another, different variations of a language one from another, different cultural practices and different ways of life. And their lives had developed differently also because of the different climates in which they find themselves. So, for example, even on the island of Hokkaido, the Ainu, who were mostly settled on the west coast of the island, had a more Arctic or Siberian climate to contend with, and those living on the eastern or Pacific side of the island of Hokkaido had a more temperate Pacific climate that they were dealing with. So from 1945, this story is complicated even further. And if we were to look at all of these periods of Ainu history on one map, we would say that there are Ainu people concentrated on the island of Hokkaido in the deep green here, that they most likely arrive from the kind of across ice sheets from the Siberian section of the Asian mainland, that some of their settlements in the north of the island of Honshu are progressively affected from the 8th and 9th centuries by the territorial expansion of an emerging kind of proto-Japanese state, that they remain concentrated, the Hokkaido Ainu remain concentrated on the island of Hokkaido until their 19th century reservation and assimilation in the modern Japanese state. And from the middle of the 20th century, there is a resettlement of Ainu people living in Sakhalin and the Kurile Islands onto the Hokkaido mainland as well. Then if we look at the island of Hokkaido itself, which you see in that cutaway of the map on your screen, you can see that even on the island, the people of the Ainu people are concentrated in different modern settlements. This is kind of as a result of two things. One of them is a more ancient practice of living in certain parts of the island because of its two quite distinct climates and responding in everyday life to those different kind of climatic concerns. But it's also to do with the concentration of the reservations where the Ainu people resettled, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes forcibly, as a result to increased Japanese interest in the island of Hokkaido from the 16th and 17th centuries, with a real intensification of colonization in the 19th and 20th centuries. So this is a very, as you can appreciate perhaps from this historical context, this is a very difficult kind of set of circumstances to unravel, with more investigations continuing, both archaeological and anthropological, and a lot of, at the moment, particularly a lot of research being carried out into the linguistics, so into the history of the Ainu language and what that might tell us about the origins of the Ainu people. So it's very much something where we should be watching this space. A lot more information is coming out all the time. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm concentrating on the Hokkaido Ainu because that's our particular focus. And the Hokkaido Ainu were originally a maritime people. So like the Ainu living on Sakhalin and the Kurile Islands, they were originally engaged in maritime trade of some particular commodities. But over time, their settlements actually kind of turn inward. In a sense, they look into the interior of the island instead, and instead they base their settlements around rivers, and they become a riverine people rather than a maritime trading people. And it's the commodities that they can access from their communities as riverine people that they will then export, and they then are interested in importing, as we'll see in some of their artifacts, luxury commodities from other maritime trading people that they engage with. So what we can say about the Ainu on Hokkaido is that their culture begins to focus around rivers. And as such, when Ainu settlements are found in the 19th century, by the time that Western but also Japanese anthropologists are interested in looking at the Ainu and studying them, there's a certain kind of organization to an Ainu settlement on Hokkaido, which is useful for those of us who are traveling there to consider. So what we find is that a village or a kotan is concentrated around a river or a particularly important tributary of a river. Rivers were important to the Ainu because of their reliance on salmon as a main form of their protein. We'll look at that a bit more closely as well. So we see marked here on this diagram of a kind of a typical Ainu settlement. We can see that at 1 and 2, we've got kind of an agricultural interest in the river as a source of food, but also of communication with other settlements, of transportation, and of river banks as a place to collect leaves and roots that formed a substantial part of the diet, along with preserved meats over the winter, which could be quite bitter. Particularly for the Ainu living more on the western side of the island of Hokkaido. At 3, we see terraces, some of which are kind of encouraged in their arrangement by human intervention to enable deer hunting. So deer in autumn were a really important form of protein. Deer meat was preserved and used for sustenance during winter. So you can see that the settlement has good proximity to terraces that allow for grasses to grow that attract the deer for hunting. But you can see with the fencing and with some of the land works that that's actually, well, by kind of direct human intervention. The hillsides that then sloped up to the very dramatic mountains that many of us think of when we think of Hokkaido, we think kind of call to mind its volcanic origins, and we can summon its very dramatic mountains. Well, the hillsides and mountain slopes were places where deer hunting would take place in other seasons, but also where very culturally significant bear hunts would unfold, and bear hunting is something that we'll return to as well. But mountains were also important for the gathering of commodities that the Ainu used to clothe themselves, such as elm bark, which is something else that we'll look at a bit more closely. And that has now, along with the bear, elm bark has become something that's quite, and salmon. These are 3 very identifiably kind of Ainu cultural products. So we'll look at those together. We'll talk a little bit more about men and women Ainu and how their time was spent, but in fact, women engaged in pretty much all of these activities that you see unfolding around a kotan or village, except for bear hunting. So that was a sacred activity for various reasons, as we'll see, and it was really the place where women's engagement was more limited, but otherwise the entire village was engaged in these activities that took place in a quite schematic arrangement that's been identified from village to village. Within the village, houses would be made out of thatch, so grasses, dried grasses and reeds, and they were mostly for nuclear family groups. So villagers tended to live within nuclear families. The arrangement of each house was quite similar. You can see that in this photo from about 1880, which was taken as part of an American university expedition in Hokkaido. And you can see that houses have porches where objects would be stored for agricultural pursuits. Each house had a hearth in which the sacred goddess of fire, Fuchi, was enshrined. In some ways, the whole house was arranged around her hearth for practical reasons, obviously, but also because of the kind of sacred nature of her inhering in that space. But aside from the hearth, the houses would be oriented towards a sacred window. You can see a sacred window or kamoi puya in this photo, almost at the extreme right, that house on the extreme right of this image. You can just see a window opening and the man is standing in front of that, tending the drying salmon on racks outside the sacred window. And the sacred window of each kotan, of each house within the kotan, was oriented in the same way. It either faced upstream or it faced up into the mountains, because that was the source of the two very precious commodities, but also important spiritual forces, and those were the spirits associated with the salmon and with the bears. Outside of the sacred window, you would find an altar on which rituals associated with those deities were associated. Fuchi, the goddess of fire, she's really the animating principle of each household and of each village, really. I mean, all rituals started at the fire, so started with her kind of sacred impulse, and then they would move from the fire, from the hearth, over to the sacred window. And the sacred window was where the spirit, the kind of life force of a bear, would enter and exit a house. And as we'll see, that life force of the bear was very necessary in a sacred spiritual sense, but it was also thought to bring with it lots of attendant practical benefits as well. So that orientation of the sacred window was very important. You can see in this copy of an 18th century scroll that in the mainland of Japan, there was a real interest in how the Ainu lived. So this scroll was produced for Wajin, so kind of Honshu Japanese, who were fascinated by the people of Ezo, as Hokkaido was known until the 19th century. So you can see in this 18th century scroll quite a faithful representation of what we've just seen in the late 19th century photograph. So we see the thatch roof houses of the kotan and the orientation of them on the plain towards the source of the salmon and also of the bear. And this hand scroll, which has been particularly useful for understanding the Ainu on Hokkaido before a very concerted colonization program took place in the 19th century. So certainly in the 18th century, the Ainu on Hokkaido are already in daily contact with the Wajin or Honshu Japanese, thanks to that kind of trade policy from the 15th and 16th century executed by the clan of the Matsamai. So it's not that this is an untouched people at the time that this scroll was made. That's another kind of complicating factor when thinking about the Ainu, is that they've been in very close contact with the Wajin or Honshu Japanese from the 15th century onwards. But you can see that fascination that the Wajin had with the Ainu means that we get this attentive record of the interior of an Ainu house in the late 18th century. So you can see that while the materials of the house are quite simple and rudimentary, you can see nevertheless that there are items here that have clearly been imported. So lacquerware, for example, ritual sake cups. As I said, rice wasn't grown on Hokkaido. It has a very different agricultural history in that respect, still does even today. But it was nevertheless imported, as was sake, for use in sacred ceremonies. So as a luxury commodity, it was seen as something to offer to the gods, that you offered the gods the best, and that included sake. So here you see the sacred hearth for the goddess Fuchi, which is also obviously the practical hearth then of each house as well. Ainu men and women were of great interest to the Wajin or the Honshu Japanese. There was a kind of a visual differentiation between the Ainu and the Wajin, which you will still hear discussed, the idea that the hair of Ainu people tended to be curly or a little more coarse, that the coloring of the skin was different, although presumably that's also affected by lifestyle as well. And something that was considered quite distinctive was that Ainu women were often tattooed in quite prominent ways, so particularly around the mouth, for example. The clothing of the Ainu was of great interest to the Wajin or Honshu Japanese as well. So you can see careful attention here to hairstyles, to jewelry. The woman's jewelry, as we'll see shortly, is clearly imported. She's wearing it because it's a very important occasion that's been recorded here. And the clothing that you see here for the men and the women is actually made out of weaving with elm bark fibers. So that's something else that we'll return to shortly as well. As I said, women and men, their work was shared for the sake of the entire community. Women hunted salmon, they hunted deer, they gathered leaves and nuts. Many Ainu villages had kitchen-style gardens, little small vegetable gardens where plants were cultivated for consumption that women often tended. What women didn't really participate in was bear hunting, and also carving of both sacred and daily objects out of wood. So those were areas of labor that were particularly male in focus, bear hunting and wood carving, but women were engaged in most other activities and also in some pretty extraordinary forms of production. So weaving and textile work was usually women's work in Ainu villages. This is a chitarape, or a woven mat. You'll see a number of these, sometimes spread across the floor as mats, sometimes hung on the wall as almost a kind of tapestry arrangement. This one that you can see here, which dates to the late 19th century and is now in Minneapolis, it's made out of various grasses and fibers, and then the introduction of imported cotton thread. And because this has no real patina of use, many of these late 19th century Ainu artifacts, which are now in American collections or form the basis of American university collections, it's thought that these were already being produced as a kind of tourist commodity. So they weren't being made, an Ainu woman didn't make this for use in her own house. She made it quite consciously to sell to a Westerner who was traveling through Hokkaido in order to, encounter this supposed primitive or early culture, an idea that we'll return to. Women, for important occasions, wore quite decorated jewelry. This amulet is made out of metal and glass beads, which were imported from China. There are some great examples of these, not just in the British Museum, as you see here, but also in the museum collections on Hokkaido. And the jewelry, which is a kind of a protective amulet, the jewelry could be extraordinarily detailed. So this would have been assembled by Ainu women from imported and local materials. And the clothing was mostly made from local materials. This is a man's coat that is now in a museum in Leiden, which was collected in the 19th century and seems to have been made in the 19th century as well. And the panels of this coat are actually made from dried salmon skin. It had really good waterproof characteristics, so it could be used. Salmon skin was dried by the women and used to caulk boats. There are some fabulous examples of Ainu boots made out of salmon skin and lined with fur, and here you see an entire coat made out of salmon skin. But in some ways, the more iconic material with which Ainu women were working is a kind of bark. This is from the elm tree, where the bark would be harvested very carefully, and its inner fiber stripped and then woven on a loom. And once hand looms are imported in larger quantities from mainland Asia, from China in particular, but also from the island of Honshu, these become more and more intricate pieces that are woven, and then also, as you can see here, sometimes decorated with pieces of applique as well. And these are known as a tush. There are some phenomenal examples of these robes throughout, particularly American collectors, because it was American university professors who were undertaking a lot of the 19th century travels as experts on the island of Hokkaido and then taking back vast quantities of clothing. Cotton begins to be imported in greater quantities in the 19th century as Hokkaido is increasingly modernized. And this means that what had once been very small strips of cloth that were tied to the hair or almost worn as earring kind of decoration, they were far too precious to use to make clothing, but they were used as decoration for really significant and important occasions. From the 19th century, those too would be woven into the kind of extraordinary coats with applique that you saw on my title image for this presentation. So again, those really beautiful 19th century cotton examples of Ainu robes seem to be being made not for Ainu people to wear, but consciously as a tourist export. And that's something, again, that's a consideration to keep in mind, the way that the Ainu from the 19th century have had to think about their culture and what makes it distinctive and unique, and think about ways to make that attractive to a consumer kind of tourist economy. It's very interesting 19th century development, I think. Now, you might notice that the designs on a lot of these artifacts, from clothing through to some of the household objects that I'll show you, are very abstract. And a scholar has studied traditional Ainu designs as survive in those 19th century artifacts, the pieces that have been collected in the 19th century, but also in the 19th century photographs. So before a kind of wholesale contact with the wider world in the 20th century, and then a suppression of traditional Ainu designs under the assimilation policy. And what that's revealed is that more or less there are about 20 different abstract designs that would be used by Ainu women when decorating textiles, or used by men when carving wooden objects. And these are almost all abstract rather than directly figurative. And that was done quite consciously to avoid attracting evil spirits. So the more figurative your design, the more its potential to attract an evil spirit who objected to its likeness being shown, essentially. And this is again something that changes in the 19th century when the Ainu are consciously thinking about tourist products that they can offer. There you do see much more figurative designs coming in from the late 19th century to appeal to a tourist market. Some of the artifacts that survive with these abstract designs are very beautiful. So this is a woven sword strap, essentially. The Ainu men carried their swords across their back. That was considered very interesting for the Wajin or Honshu Japanese, because samurai carried their swords at their side, ready at any moment, or the Ainu men were carrying their swords on their back with specially woven halters and straps. And there's quite large numbers of these that survive with these very abstract designs. There's no patina on a lot of these late 19th century objects, again suggesting that they have been made for an export market. And so I guess a consideration to keep in mind there is, did the man who carved this wooden tray in the late 19th century, did he consciously think about designs that would appeal to a buyer, to someone purchasing this product? Or did he instead really authentically represent traditional Ainu designs on this carved tray? You can see that it has no patina, it's never been used, whereas you'll see examples in museums in Hokkaido in particular of objects that were used by families for everyday preparation and serving of food. And obviously over time they've been chipped, they've got cracks, they've got the oil from the foodstuffs that were served on them, so they develop a patina over time, whereas this, you can see, is perfectly clean. So is this something that has a longer kind of echo in Ainu culture that can tell us something about designs over time, or was this something that the man at the time realized would sell? Regardless, we can say that the wood carving technique of Ainu men was very high. They were usually carving with walnut or Japanese pagoda tree wood, generally abstract rather than figurative designs, as I've said, in order to avoid bad luck. Very rarely there would be representations of people, fish, salmon, or bears, and those were for spirit sending ceremonies, which we'll talk about in a moment. But very interesting to think about the variation in technique. So just variation between depths of carving, for example, and always working with an idea of gestalt. So the eye kind of switching between a black and a white, a positive and a negative. So in that sense, quite similar to the conception of Japanese woodblock prints from the island of Honshu at more or less the same time. So the one thing that we can say about the Japanese aesthetically is that they have an enormous capacity to switch between a kind of a black and white, a reverse, a positive and a negative, a reverse and an obverse, for example. So an ability to kind of switch back and forth where Western eyes tend to kind of see through gradations of tone or distance, for example. That's how our art has trained us to see. One thing we can say about the Japanese, and even also as you see here about the Ainu, is that their eye is quite happy switching back and forth between a positive and a negative very, very quickly, something that a Western eye can take a little bit longer to stop and think, wait, what am I looking at? How is this made? Which part came first? What's raised? What's not raised? What's sunken? A kind of an extraordinary a graphic eye. The other kinds of objects that survive that men were carving often have to do with rituals and ceremonies. Prayer sticks, for example, there are a number, this is what you're looking at on the screen here. There's a large quantity of those that survive, and there's been a revival of the use of prayer sticks in Ainu culture, particularly in Hokkaido today. The idea that when a moment is important, when a new spirit is coming into your life, or when something its spirit has been exhausted, it's time to send it away out of your life because it's had its useful moment. It's time to send it on its way now. It's become quite a cultural practice again to use prayer sticks to mark those moments of coming and going of useful spirits, useful presences. And they would also be marked by prayer sticks. These are pieces of wood that have been shaved. So that's not rope. Those are shavings that you see on the right there. And these are thought to represent birds who will help deliver human prayers to the gods. This is quite common, the idea of the bird as a spirit helper. It's something that is an important part of Siberian spiritual rituals, but equally Shinto ones. So again, that question of, are the Ainu more connected to mainland Asia, particularly Siberia, or are they more connected to the Wajin or Honshu Japanese? Again, a kind of equivocal result there. Many Ainu words for spiritual practices are quite closely related to the Japanese ones. So the words for God are quite similar. The word for prayer and for worship are quite similar, and linguistic scholars debate kind of chicken and the egg with that usage there. And there are connections between the traditional Japanese spiritual beliefs of Shinto and the Ainu spiritual world. So everything, animate or inanimate, enshrines the spirit of a god visiting Earth. And the gods inside all of those objects, animate and inanimate, are making something available to humans for our use through their materiality. So the spirit that inheres in the tree offers material uses to humans through that substance of the wood. And so we can use these animate and inanimate objects for our housing, for our lumber, for our food, for our clothing. We can use them with respect. But when the time comes, you have to send those spirits back to the spirit world with what's called a sending ceremony. So when you get a new car, you will have a ceremony to acknowledge the spirit that has come into that car in order to offer you something for your use. But by the same token, when that car has, reached its point of utility and it's time for you to replace it and get a new car, you'll send the spirit away respectfully from the car as well. So modern day Ainu are coming up with really culturally vibrant ways to continue these practices in a contemporary world. So the car is an example, a real example. There's a lovely article by an Ainu woman living in Sapporo who describes the ritual that she and her husband have for their car, for example. But at the same time, there were, in traditional Ainu culture, there were chief deities, spirits who had such an important role to play in fostering human life that the most elaborate and important rituals were reserved for those. And they were animals such as the bear, the salmon, and also the owl. So owls were guardians of the kotan or village, and so they also had important ceremonies. So let's start with the salmon sending ceremony. Here we see Ainu men fishing for salmon circa 1900. Salmon and bear, human life for the Ainu wasn't really possible without either of those animals. They played an enormously important part in terms of fostering human life and prosperity. So for the salmon, there were a whole series of ceremonies that would be carried out at different times. So the first ceremony was a kind of a vigil held waiting for the salmon god or kamui to appear and therefore enable a kind of forecasting or prediction of when the first run of salmon would begin. When the salmon began, there would be when the first run of salmon appeared, there would be another ceremony held near the village or kotan that would welcome the kind of first salmon visitors of the season. There was another ceremony held at the end of spawning time in which one mandible bone would be chosen to represent all the salmon gods who had visited and been caught by the local villagers, and that one mandible would represent the spirit of all of the salmon gods being sent home. There were times then when it was taboo to hunt the salmon, as again, speaking from an Australian context, might remind you of indigenous knowledge around when we should hunt this animal, when we should leave it to reproduce, don't go out hunting it. And there's the sacred ceremonies that also were celebrated at that time. So similar kind of thing in terms of the salmon runs. The salmon were not just consumed for their flesh. They were the mainstay of the diet. It certainly wasn't bear or deer. It was salmon that was the mainstay of the Ainu diet. In fact, 19th century visitors to Hokkaido, both Wajin, so Honshu Japanese, but also the visitors from places like America in particular, all commented on the pervasive smell of dried fish across the entire island. But the skin, as I've said, was used for caulking and waterproofing, for making shoes and coats. And so although the bear was in some ways a kind of chief deity for the Ainu on Hokkaido, the salmon was it's the ultimate kind of companion of the bear, both in spiritual terms, but also in practical everyday living terms. And so you can imagine the impact at the end of the 19th century when the Japanese colonize Hokkaido more actively and salmon fishing is forbidden. The Ainu are no longer allowed to fish for salmon because licenses needed to be given to commercial fisheries instead. And this has remained a point of political contention until present times. So Ainu fishing rights on traditional lands are still something that is contested every year, that kind of interruption from the end of the 19th century of this very traditional way of life, so how the Ainu actually lived, but also, as you've heard, something that is one of the key spiritual ceremonies, key spiritual aspects of Ainu culture. The other thing that has impacted on the Ainu ability to continue their role as active salmon fishers across the island of Hokkaido is, since the 20th century, the increased damming of the rivers that they traditionally fished from, which have, of course, affected the salmon's ability to spawn upstream. But far and away, the most important of the sending ceremonies was the one held for bears, known as the iomante. And the iomante still takes place in modified ways. It's a kind of protected cultural practice that can unfold in very specific sets of circumstances in very small, kind of concentrated number of places. But this was something that fascinated the Wajin or Honshu Japanese. You can see from that same 18th century scroll of daily life on the distant island of Ezo. There's a whole series of drawings on that scroll that focus on the iomante, or the bear ceremony. And the fascination with the bear sending ceremony was so strong in the 19th century with the Western and Japanese anthropologists who were starting to look at the Ainu, that the bear really ended up becoming the entire symbol of the island of Hokkaido. And still today, you'll see a kind of tourist symbol par excellence for Hokkaido is a bear with a salmon in its mouth. So essentially, in the iomante, a bear cub might be captured by members of a kotan or village when they were out hunting bears on the mountain. So they might capture the mother or the father bear and find a bear cub in the process. And if they did find a bear cub, so they don't specifically go out hunting for the cubs, but if they end up capturing a bear cub, that cub would be taken back by a family and raised outside the family's house for 1 to 2 years. So it would be kept in a large wicker cage. It would be very carefully fed by the family, very well looked after, chained, but very well looked after, and really treated as the lord of the family. But when the time came, the spirit of that bear had to be sent back to the spirit world in order to send a message to the rest of the spirit world. So because the bear was the kind of the top of the tree of the deities for the Ainu, they believed if they treated the bear very well when it was alive and then sent it back to the spirit world with the right kind of attendant ceremonies, the bear would invite all the other key deities and say, look at this village, look at this family, look how well they treated me. Salmon deity, deer deity, fox deity, elm bark deity, you should also all go to this village and offer your material substance to the benefit of these people because they'll treat you really well. So as part of the period of 1 to 2 years when the bear cub is raised, it's treated extremely well. And then when it is killed and its spirit sent back to the spirit world, that's done in a very careful kind of way. So on the day of its ritual death, the bear would be ceremonially paraded through the kotan or village. It would be shot with ritual arrows by a number of men and then strangled by 2 men. After the bear had died, it would be skinned. The skin would be retained. It was used for various things. It was an important part of the commemoration of the ceremony. And the head would be retained. It would be taken into the house through that sacred window, and the spirit of the bear, but also of the bear with a capital B, of all bears, would then be invited into the house through that communication of the head of the bear with the sacred window. And then a great feast would ensue. There would be singing and dancing, and that was day 1. On day 2, the head would be ritually decorated and its spirit would be sent back to the spirit world. So it's had a day to be celebrated for its contribution, and then a day to be asked to go back to the spirit world and spread the news about how well these villagers treat the deities and how useful it would be if other deities would follow suit and join that village. And in order to keep that line of communication with the spirit world open, the bear head would be mounted for a time outside of the sacred window of that house. So this was the kind of key spiritual ceremony for the Ainu people, one that's quite well documented for us because we have scrolls like this that go through, just showing you one scene, but it goes through, the scrolls go through all of the stages of the process. And then in the late 19th century, with the arrival of both anthropologists and tourists, there was a huge amount of interest in this ceremony. Also for the anthropologists, because of its echoes of other ceremonies that were being studied in the culture of indigenous or Native Americans at that time. And so as a result, the Iomante was also quite a well-documented, photographically documented ceremony as well. And the entire kind of purpose of this ceremony was for the bear spirit to tell all of the other deities that this village was a good place to come and offer your bounty in a spiritual and also material form. That late 19th century interest in the Ainu is something, just by way of conclusion, that we need to take carefully into account when thinking about Ainu culture as it's presented to us as travelers to Japan today. I mean, Roman Hitchcock is one of the most important American collectors of Ainu artifacts. The Smithsonian has a fabulous collection of works as a result. But in 1888, he noted about the Ainu, they now use Japanese knives instead of stone implements and metal arrowheads in place of flint. But it is scarcely a century since they emerged from the Stone Age, and otherwise they have not passed beyond it. So there's an anthropological interest in the Ainu, but in order to find in them the origins of something else. So in order to identify them as an uncivilized, primitive, barbarian, savage, these are not my words, these are the words used by American and Japanese anthropologists about the Ainu at the end of the 19th century, that then means that what we understand about the Ainu after that time, both because of assimilation policies, but also because of this kind of quasi-anthropological interest of 19th century travelers to Hokkaido, has influenced some of the ways that we see and understand their culture subsequently. So there's almost an idea in the 19th century with the study of the Ainu on the island of Hokkaido in green here, soon to be bolstered in a sense by the arrival of two very different groups of Ainu from the Kural and the Sakhalin Islands. There's this idea that somehow the Ainu might represent the noble savage and the roots of Caucasian man. So one early scholar of Ainu culture says about the Ainu that Hokkaido represents an island of Caucasoids in a sea of Mongoloids. So there's very much a racial aspect to the way in which the Ainu are being studied in isolation from the people around them, and in order to prove a kind of conclusion of which they are really the kind of primitive evidence. So you heard that in Roman Hitchcock's statement that the Ainu are fascinating, but they're fascinating because they stayed at that primitive point and didn't follow the other Caucasoids in terms of the development of Westerners or European Caucasian people. At the same time, in the 19th century, when the Ainu are being actively concentrated onto the island of Hokkaido that you see here, and encouraged and then legislated to assimilate into Wajin Japanese culture, there's also this increasing panic then that they, at the end of the 19th century, are a group of people on the verge of extinction. And this is the same kind of panic, again, speaking from an Australian context, that we hear about Indigenous Australians at the end of the 19th century too. So this notion that it's somehow a weaker or more vulnerable group that's close to the edge of extinction, a language that's dying, a culture that's no longer vibrant, and that too might affect the way that people at the time certainly examined the Ainu and their history and culture, but also might have kind of a vestige in how we understand the Ainu today. So I just wanted to conclude by kind of giving you the flip side of that, which is, of that small self-identified group of Ainu that I spoke about at the beginning of the presentation, about 25,000 people in 2006, nevertheless, there's a really active and engaged group within the Ainu who are arguing for recognition of the Ainu as an Indigenous people of Japan, and therefore the kind of attendant rights and affirmative action that will follow on from that. There is a really concerted effort to understand and teach the Ainu language. And if you travel to the island of Hokkaido, I think you'll have lots of opportunities to see how material culture of the Ainu, and hopefully you will also understand how the spiritual culture of the Ainu also continues to be celebrated. Thanks very much.